In the remote highlands of South America, nestled between dry ridges and green river valleys, there exists a small rural community that most maps don't even bother naming. For generations, the families here have relied on farming potatoes, corn, and raising a few goats. Their tools are rudimentary: wooden plows, metal buckets, and the same types of shovels their grandfathers once used. But what sets them apart from thousands of other humble farmers around the world isn't what they grow in the soil. It's what they take from it. Beneath these fields lies a gold-bearing sediment so rich that, for nearly a decade now, a group of these families has been quietly pulling out over $12 million in gold annually, without machinery, without explosives, and without the world even noticing. It all began when a severe drought nearly wiped out the crops one year. With the rivers reduced to mere trickles and the soil too dry for planting, desperation set in. A group of farmers decided to dig small trenches near the base of the hills where water used to flow, hoping to divert what little remained of the underground springs into new irrigation ditches. As they shoveled deeper, they noticed something strange: heavy black sand clinging to their tools, and faint golden specks mixed within it. One of the elders, who had once worked in a distant gold mine in his youth, instantly recognized the signs. These weren't ordinary river sediments. This was alluvial soil rich in placer gold. They didn't rush to sell it or announce the find. Instead, the families kept the discovery a closely guarded secret. Using nothing more than basic plastic tubs, rusted sieves, and shovels sharpened by decades of use, they began a quiet process of extraction. Every day before dawn, they would walk in pairs to the dig sites, often covering their tools with potato sacks to avoid suspicion. They dug by hand, carefully following the natural curves of the former waterbeds. Each bucket of dirt was taken to a hidden washing station behind an old stone hut, where the separation process began. The method was deceptively simple. The soil would be poured into a wide metal pan with water scooped from rain barrels. They'd swirl it gently, allowing the lighter dirt to spill over the edge while the heavier materials, mostly black sand and metal flakes, settled at the bottom. This process, known as panning, was repeated hundreds of times a day, and in nearly every batch, they found specks of gold. Some were as small as dust. Others were visible flakes, flat and shiny, clinging to the pan like stubborn crumbs. On rare occasions, a nugget the size of a bean would gleam up from the mud, sending waves of excitement through the group. By the end of the first year, they had quietly gathered enough gold to fill a small safe kept hidden under one of the floorboards of a communal hut. They didn't sell it immediately. They waited, learning how the international gold market worked, identifying buyers in nearby cities, and creating a system of rotating transport, so no single person ever carried too much at once. The first official sale was done through a legal middleman who assumed he was helping offload family heirlooms. When the payment came through, more than $80,000, they realized they were sitting on something much bigger than they had imagined. Over time, word spread among trusted relatives, and a cooperative was formed. But they refused to mechanize. That was a deliberate decision. They knew that once machines were brought in, outsiders would take notice. Large companies, possibly even the government, might move in and claim the land for themselves. By keeping it manual, small-scale, and seemingly agricultural, they remained invisible. To this day, the community continues to present itself as a humble farming village. Old tools, dirt roads, no heavy trucks, and no visible signs of industrial mining. But underground, a quiet rhythm persists. Small trenches lead into narrow cuts in the hillsides. Wooden ladders descend into pits less than 10 feet deep. Teams of 2 or 3 work in shifts, filling up buckets with sediment and passing them up by hand. Above ground, others carry the loads to washing stations covered by canvas tarps. In these makeshift labs, the gold is extracted, weighed, and stored in coated bags that are eventually transferred to hidden safes. Every 2 or 3 months, a selected team drives the gold out in an unmarked vehicle to a trusted buyer. The money is divided evenly among the cooperative members, with a portion reinvested in schools, healthcare, and village infrastructure. What's even more surprising is the purity of the gold. Unlike deeper mining operations where the gold is locked inside or that must be crushed and chemically treated, the placer gold found here is naturally free. This means it can be sold almost immediately with minimal processing. Assayers have routinely recorded purity levels above 85%, with some nuggets reaching over 90%. That level of quality commands premium prices on the international market, especially when sold discreetly through networks that value ethical and environmentally gentle extraction. Despite their financial success, the farmers maintain the appearance of normalcy. Their homes are modest. Most still wear the same patched clothing they've always worn. Their children walk to school carrying old backpacks. But look closer, and you'll notice details that don't quite fit the narrative. The village now has a solar-powered medical clinic staffed by a nurse who trained in the capital. There's a new water filtration system installed near the well, and several children have been quietly enrolled in private boarding schools in the city. None of this screams luxury, but for a village that previously had no electricity or plumbing, these are signs of sudden, quiet progress. Outsiders who visit often leave puzzled. They see no luxury cars, no gold jewelry, no lavish buildings. Just quiet people working the soil, carrying buckets, and tending to goats. They assume the stories of gold must be exaggerated. But those who look deeper, who walk the riverbeds with trained eyes, begin to notice the subtle signs. The black sand piled neatly behind huts. The grooves in the hills shaped not by erosion, but by careful hands. The way some tools are polished smooth from use, not time. The truth hides in plain sight. And so year after year, without the clamor of drills or the smoke of refineries, these farmers pull millions from the earth with shovels, buckets, and centuries-old knowledge passed down like a sacred ritual. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme. It's a way of life, measured, intentional, and deeply rooted in trust. Every ounce of gold that leaves the village carries not only economic value, but also the weight of collective survival. In a world obsessed with speed, scale, and spectacle, this quiet miracle stands as a reminder that sometimes the richest treasures come not from what we build, but from what we quietly protect. The growing success of the operation brought subtle changes to the rhythm of the village. Where once dawn broke with the lowing of cattle and the clatter of ox carts, now it began with quiet footsteps and the faint scrape of shovels against soil. The cooperative members became masters of silence and routine. Their movements were calculated, almost rehearsed, tools hidden beneath harvest sacks, washing stations camouflaged with woven reed mats, and buckets stacked as if waiting to carry water instead of gold-laced sediment. These details weren't just practical. They were essential to maintaining their secret. In a region where outside interest could easily lead to confiscation or exploitation, invisibility was the community's greatest asset. Among the most respected members of the group was a man named Hernando, a former schoolteacher who had returned to the village after retirement. Though he had never trained as a miner, his analytical mind became central to optimizing the operation. It was Hernando who mapped the underground flow of the ancient rivers by observing the surrounding hills, tracing the lines where erosion had revealed heavier sand deposits. He marked each promising site with colored stones and implemented a rotation strategy to prevent the land from being overworked. The system was simple but effective. Each team worked a specific site for 2 weeks before moving on, allowing the terrain to settle and recover, avoiding suspicion from outsiders. It was Hernando who also proposed the idea of building underground storage cavities, small, stone-lined pockets buried beneath ordinary garden beds or chicken coops. Here, gold could be stored in pouches sealed with beeswax, hidden in jars or cloth sacks, and left undisturbed until the next transport run. These stashes were never concentrated in one place. Instead, they were scattered strategically, with each family entrusted with a portion. This way, if any one cache were discovered or compromised, the others would remain untouched. The system fostered trust, responsibility, and a deeper sense of shared protection over the wealth they had uncovered. The village elders, most of whom had lived through harsh winters and even harsher economic droughts, were initially skeptical of the growing prosperity. They feared that sudden wealth would erode the fabric of their traditions, that greed would replace community, and that outsiders would eventually notice. To prevent this, a set of unspoken rules was created. No family was to build large homes. No electronics beyond what was needed for basic health and education. No purchases that couldn't be justified by a harvest or local trade. Even the transport of gold was governed by rotating duty. No one person would make the same trip twice in a row, and no route would ever be repeated. They used old trucks that looked like they belonged on potato farms, their undercarriages modified with hidden compartments padded with straw and dirt to mask any precious cargo. Despite all precautions, one event nearly shattered everything. A stranger arrived during planting season, an energetic man in his 40s, claiming to be a soil researcher from a nearby university. He asked questions, took photographs, and spent far too much time near the dig sites. The farmers smiled politely and gave him little information, but his presence triggered concern. Hernando called for an emergency meeting beneath the oldest tree at the edge of the village, where discussions had always been held away from curious ears. The decision was swift. All activity would pause for 2 weeks. Tools were buried, washing pans hidden, and buckets filled only with water. The stranger saw nothing out of the ordinary and eventually left with dusty boots and a notebook filled with trivial observations. But the warning was clear. One mistake, one misstep, and everything could come undone. In the months that followed, the cooperative tightened their protocols. Children were told not to speak of gold, even in whispers. Visiting relatives were welcomed, but never shown the workstations. And all financial transactions were handled with extreme caution. They began converting gold not directly into cash, but into livestock, seeds, medical supplies, and long-term education plans. The cooperative helped build a scholarship fund in the city under a different name, one that bore no trace of their village. When one child became the first in the region to attend a national science fair, it was celebrated quietly, without fanfare, but with immense pride. These small victories were the true wealth they sought to preserve. Still, not all neighbors were blind. Nearby communities began noticing that despite poor harvests, the villagers always seemed to have enough. Their animals were better fed. Their clothes, though simple, were new. A few whispers made it to regional officials, prompting a low-level inspection team to visit. This time, the farmers were ready. They choreographed an entire performance. Old tools laid out near the fields, storage barns full of drying corn, and elders seated in front of weaving looms. Every sign pointed to an industrious, but entirely unremarkable agricultural village. The inspectors stayed for 2 days, asked a few questions, ate a hearty meal, and left with no evidence of mining activity. The performance had worked, but it reinforced the importance of discipline. Even the slightest vanity could jeopardize everything. Ironically, what made the operation possible was the very thing that had once made the village suffer: its remoteness. The roads were long, narrow, and often impassable in the rainy season. No mining company had ever bothered to survey the area, and no government initiative had considered it worth investing in. This invisibility became their shield, but it also became their burden. Every bucket filled meant hours of labor. Every ounce of gold required patience and secrecy. They had no conveyor belts, no pumps, no excavators, only hands worn by time and hearts trained by necessity. Yet there was something profound in the rhythm of their work. It wasn't just about survival. It had become a symbol of resilience and self-determination. Each pan of swirling water wasn't just washing away dirt. It was erasing dependence, reclaiming dignity. And each small flake of gold that settled at the bottom was more than a mineral. It was proof that wisdom passed down through generations, combined with cooperation and restraint, could achieve what modern machines often fail to do: build prosperity without destruction. The younger generation, raised in this dual reality of rural life and quiet prosperity, began to inherit more than land or tools. They inherited the code: respect the earth, share the gain, never speak of the gold. One boy, barely 13, became known for his precision panning skills, able to isolate gold with a single rinse. a girl just 16, designed a rainwater filtration system that made the washing process more efficient while conserving their limited water supply. These small innovations ensured the sustainability of the process while reinforcing the sense of community pride. And so the cycle continued, digging, panning, hiding, transporting. The world around them changed, with technology reaching even the most rural parts of the continent. But the cooperatives stayed true to their mission. Not out of nostalgia, but out of survival. They knew that if the world saw what they were doing, it would try to take it. If companies came with machines, the rivers would be poisoned, the hills flattened, and the gold gone within years. But with buckets and shovels, they could stretch this miracle across generations. And for them, that was worth more than anything else. Not all discoveries bring comfort. As the years passed and the cooperative's methods became more efficient, the weight of secrecy began to grow heavier. The gold kept coming, buried in the earth like veins of quiet power. But with each ounce collected, the risk increased. One slip of the tongue, one careless purchase, one photograph on the wrong phone, and everything could unravel. The elders understood this better than anyone. They had lived through land disputes, through promises made by foreign companies that never materialized, and they knew how quickly governments changed their tone when money entered the equation. What was once a humble village could become a battleground overnight if the truth got out. To safeguard their way of life, the cooperative doubled down on education, not only for the children, but for the adults too. Workshops were held under the guise of agricultural training, but inside those walls, villagers learned how to recognize surveillance drones, how to handle inquiries from strangers, and even how to route money through cooperative-owned businesses in distant towns. Hernando, ever the teacher, created simple guides that could be memorized without ever writing a word. They used symbols drawn in the dirt to represent transport routes, storage points, and emergency signals. If a visitor arrived unannounced, the position of a broom against a wall, or a pile of corn husks arranged in a particular way, could send a message across the village within minutes. While secrecy remained their shield, the villagers also began to invest in their legacy. Quietly, without disrupting the rhythms of their days, they built the first school with reinforced stone and natural ventilation. A solar panel system was installed on the roof, disguised beneath a wooden trellis to resemble traditional roofing. Textbooks were imported, and 2 teachers from a neighboring province were hired and paid in cash. No contracts, no questions. They were told only that the community valued education above all else. The teachers stayed, intrigued by the discipline of the students and the peculiar calm of a place that seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But progress, no matter how discreet, always leaves a trace. In a nearby town, a local gold buyer began noticing a pattern. Every few months, a cleanly weighed and unusually pure batch of gold would arrive, delivered by different people each time. The weight was consistent, the quality high, and the delivery always quiet. He began to ask questions, not out of malice, but out of curiosity. Where was this gold coming from? Why had no mining license been registered in the area? The questions filtered through informal networks until eventually they reached someone with influence, a provincial consultant tasked with identifying untapped mineral resources for future development. This man, Mateo Vargas, was ambitious and had a reputation for sniffing out hidden assets. He wasn't interested in the gold for himself, not at first. But the idea of discovering a new source, mapping it, and proposing a legal mining operation could elevate his position, earn him favor, and potentially open doors in national politics. Without revealing his intentions, he began visiting villages in the region under the pretense of conducting water table research. When he arrived at the cooperative's village, he was met with the usual hospitality, food, smiles, and stories of potatoes and goat herding. But he noticed details others might miss: the unusually clean irrigation system, the presence of tools not typically used in farming, and above all, the silence. He returned a week later, this time bringing a junior geologist and a drone operator. The excuse was water conservation research. The villagers played their roles well. The dig sites were covered, the washing stations dismantled, and the gold caches relocated. Children were sent to walk goats across the hills to provide the illusion of daily activity. But drones see what eyes cannot. From above, patterns emerged, symmetrical trenches, lines of disturbed soil, and pathways leading to structures that didn't appear on any official maps. The visitors left with data, and though they said nothing, their expressions betrayed their suspicions. Hernando called for a rare full assembly. For hours, they debated their next steps. Some wanted to stop entirely, bury the tools, and vanish back into anonymity. Others argued they should fight to keep what they had built. But it was one of the youngest, a 17-year-old named Rosa, who offered a third option. She proposed creating a decoy zone, a section of land just outside the main village that would be worked openly with minimal effort, yielding small traces of gold, but nothing impressive. If officials returned, they would be shown this zone given samples and allowed to believe they had discovered the secret. The real operation would move deeper into the hills, away from the drone's line of sight. It was risky, but better than doing nothing. They agreed. Over the next month, the community staged the creation of a makeshift mining site. They let word leak through informal channels. When Mateo Vargas returned with a full inspection team, the villagers welcomed them with cautious cooperation. They showed them the new site, demonstrated basic panning techniques, and even allowed a few grams of gold to be collected on camera. The officials left satisfied, noting the low yield and assuming that any rumors had been exaggerated. Vargas published a report, filed for a minor exploration grant, and moved on to the next promising zone. The decoy had worked, but the scare changed everything. The villagers understood now that their time might be limited. Eventually, the land would be mapped, satellites would spot the real dig sites, and someone with more power and fewer scruples might take notice. So they began planning for the future, not just for themselves, but for what would come after. Gold was no longer simply a means of survival. It was a ticking clock, a finite opportunity to transform their lives before they were swallowed by the same forces that had consumed so many others before them. They used part of the profits to buy land in distant provinces under fake names. A few families quietly relocated, establishing new lives where they could operate without scrutiny. Some of the gold was melted into untraceable forms, thin sheets, jewelry, even religious artifacts that could pass through borders without suspicion. Others turned their attention to infrastructure, building seed banks, installing wind-powered wells, and reinforcing homes against floods. They weren't preparing for war. They were preparing for disappearance. But even as they planned for the future, the digging continued. The work had become sacred, not just economically, but spiritually. Each pan of earth was treated with reverence. Each nugget held not just weight, but meaning. The elders began crafting stories for the children, allegories about rivers that wept gold and hills that gave only to those who respected them. These tales served a dual purpose, passing down moral codes and embedding practical wisdom in metaphor. The children didn't just learn how to dig, they learned when to stop. They didn't just see value in gold, they saw value in balance. It was this mindset, more than any secret or system, that had kept the community safe. Greed had no place here. Those who showed signs of recklessness were gently pushed aside. Trust was more important than skill. And because of that, they endured. The gold never made them rich in the way the world defines wealth. There were no vaults, no mansions, no power plays. But they had something rarer: stability, unity, and a quiet kind of prosperity that outsiders would never fully understand. And in the hills where the wind carried only whispers, that was enough. As seasons changed and the rains returned, the soil once again became fertile enough for planting. But by now, farming had become secondary. The fields were maintained for appearance's sake, rows of potatoes and maize carefully tended by the elders and children, while the core of the village's energy remained focused underground. The gold still flowed, though not with the abundance of the first years. Sediment veins had to be followed farther into the hills, where the terrain was steeper, the digging harder, and the visibility riskier. But the cooperative adapted. New access paths were created, mimicking the trails of herders and wood collectors, and extraction rotated constantly to prevent environmental damage from drawing attention. In this next phase, innovation became their quiet ally. Tools were modified, not with technology that would alarm outsiders, but with subtle improvements that drastically increased efficiency. Wooden frames were repurposed into hand-operated classifiers to separate coarse gravel before panning. Cloth filters, treated with natural oils, helped trap fine particles of gold that often escaped traditional pans. A single manual pump, disguised as a water feeder for goats, was used to channel small amounts of water to higher elevations, allowing gravity to do much of the washing. None of this looked suspicious. To a casual visitor, it resembled nothing more than clever rural engineering. But beneath the surface, it was the foundation of a $12 million per year microeconomy. And with this new rhythm came new roles. Women, who had traditionally focused on farming and home responsibilities, became central to the refinement process. Their precision and patience made them ideal for the final panning and sorting stages, especially when handling the finest flakes and dust that demanded careful collection. They worked behind closed wooden doors, in rooms that looked like storage sheds from the outside. Here, the gold was dried, weighed with handmade scales calibrated with local stones, and packed into layers of linen and beeswax before transport. Every step had been refined to a quiet science. Nothing was wasted. Every speck counted. It was around this time that the village formed a new type of alliance, one not rooted in secrecy, but in influence. They identified sympathetic voices in nearby towns. A doctor who agreed to treat their children without asking questions. A truck driver who transported goods without ever opening the back. A retired judge who offered legal advice under the guise of visiting old friends. These individuals didn't know the full story, but they knew enough to understand that the community wasn't involved in criminal activity. They were protecting something. And in exchange for their silence, the village gave back in ways that mattered: medicine, repairs, food during dry seasons. Quiet favors, paid not in gold, but in loyalty. Still, the outside world continued its slow approach. A documentary filmmaker began working in a town 3 valleys away, investigating rural economies and hidden resource wealth. A social media post featuring drone footage of one of the outer hills, purely aesthetic, with no mention of gold, went viral. Suddenly, a wave of amateur prospectors began showing up in the region, digging carelessly near riverbeds, hoping to strike it rich. Some even wandered toward the edge of the cooperative's land. The villagers responded not with confrontation, but with misdirection. They welcomed these newcomers with crafted stories about old tales of ghost gold, sent them toward barren zones, and even scattered tiny flakes of fool's gold near visible waterbanks to keep them busy. It worked. The newcomers left frustrated, convinced the rumors were false or the deposits long gone. But the scare forced the cooperative into its most difficult discussion yet. Should they stop entirely? The children were growing up. The infrastructure was in place. Their emergency funds were strong, and many families had backup land and housing in other provinces now. Was it worth continuing the extraction? Was it greed? Now, instead of survival? They debated for days. Some argued that ending the mining would be a form of self-preservation. Others feared that stopping would be surrender, that without the gold, the systems they'd built might eventually crumble or fall into the wrong hands. It was an elder, the oldest among them, who finally spoke with clarity. He reminded them that gold was not their true wealth. It had only ever been the tool that made survival possible. The real treasure was their discipline, their unity, their refusal to become corrupted in a world that rewarded chaos and exploitation. And so they reached a new agreement. The cooperative would scale down. Extraction would be reduced to 1/3 of its original volume. A schedule was set. Only specific families, during specific times a year, would dig. The rest of the community would shift focus to rebuilding their agricultural identity, this time using the wealth they had gained to make farming sustainable and prosperous. Drip irrigation systems were installed. Organic composting programs were introduced. Beekeeping was expanded into a full-fledged trade. A small artisan cooperative was formed to sell hand-woven blankets, crafted with natural dyes and gold-threaded patterns. Another quiet way to circulate wealth without suspicion. The children, now young adults, began to step forward. One of them, Rosa, the same girl who had suggested the decoy site years earlier, began working on a university thesis about ethical rural economies, using an invented case study that mirrored her village almost exactly, without revealing its identity. Another, Tomas, used a share of the profits to open a rural medical clinic, staffed with rotating professionals who received fair pay and free lodging in exchange for their time. These weren't acts of charity. They were acts of sovereignty. And as the cooperative turned its focus outward, they began identifying other villages at risk, places where land had been stripped bare by large-scale mining, where rivers had turned toxic, where promises had been broken by foreign firms. Quietly, the cooperative offered help. Not money, but knowledge. They taught others how to protect their land, how to read geology with eyes trained by ancestors, how to resist not with protest signs, but with preparation. They became mentors without ever leaving their anonymity. What had started as a desperate dig for water had evolved into a generational strategy of resilience. Every shovel, every bucket, every hour spent panning in silence was now part of something larger. A blueprint for a future where small communities could build wealth without selling their souls. They had proven something few in the world still believed, that power could exist without domination, that wealth could grow without excess, and that gold could be extracted not only from the ground, but from the wisdom of those who chose patience over pride. And in the quiet hours before sunrise, as the mist settled over the hills and the sound of distant goats filled the valley, the people of the cooperative knew that their true legacy wasn't buried beneath the soil. It was walking in the footsteps of those who refused to be seen, but who changed everything nonetheless.